You've got to wonder, don't you? How does the machine know where to look for all the variables and functions declared in our code? And this is what I want to speak about now. We were looking at the execution context. We were understanding about the stack and that the execution contexts are placed at the top of the stack and new execution contexts are created each time a function is called. But we didn't look deeper into the execution context itself. So we understand the high level how it works. But the execution context is created in two phases. One is the creation phase and two is the execution phase. The execution phase is when all the assignments of those variables are done and the code is finally executed. So that is pretty straightforward. I want us to concentrate on this creation phase. The creation process has two distinct items. It has a lexical environment and a variable environment. Let's first look at the lexical environment. And before we actually go into detail here, I just want to zip across to the coding editor and show you what I mean by lexical environment. At least then when you're learning the theory, it will kind of help you understand what it is we're talking about. Have a look. I really don't want you to freak out about these fancy words, lexical environment. Who cares about that? Just take a step back. All a lexical environment is scope. It's another word for scope. And you create a scope by the curly brackets. Let me just shoot over to the coding editor quickly and show you what I mean. But please, I just want to stress this. Don't be intimidated by all this. Take a step back, understand what it is we're doing, and it will make complete sense. Let me show you quickly. So as I was saying, curly brackets define a scope. So there we go. On our screen, we've defined a scope. Let me even zoom in a bit more. And what's really cool about JavaScript is we can create as many scopes as we want. For example, we can do this. Now we've created two scopes, two lexical environments. And we can keep going more and more and more and more and more to our heart's content. But remember with some of these examples what we've been seeing, let's just delete this. That's getting a bit ridiculous. And let's console log a variable called x that we haven't yet defined. Now let's create a scope. And what about even another scope? And let's define a variable. Let x equal dog. What do you think is going to happen when we execute this now? With all the things we've learned with looking at the lexical environments. Remember how we had the two environments within each context? We had the lexical and we had the variable. And the lexical defined the let and the const variables. What do you think will happen here? Well, from what we've seen, we know that let doesn't get initialized until it's encountered. In fancy programming talk, this just means it's not going to be hoisted to the top. I would expect to see an error here. Let's just start Quokka. And there we go. We get an error. X is not defined. And what about if we use var? Well, as we're going to be seeing, var sits in an environment called a variable environment. And this gets assigned a value of undefined before it's initialized. So if we go var, we would expect not to see an error. In fact, I would expect to see undefined. And that's what we see. We see undefined. So you get this. You're starting to understand what a lexical environment means. So let's delete this. Let's go to our var and let's make this let again. And then what about if we now define another lexical environment? So the cool thing with let is that anything below it, any lexical environment created after it, will be valid code. So if we go console log x, we get dog. Makes sense, right? That's all I wanted to show you. Let's get back to the lecture. Okay, cool, we're back. So we're on to the creation phase of an execution context. And we know that this involves the creation of a lexical environment. And the lexical environment holds identifier variable mappings. What I mean by identifier? Well, that is just the name of the variable or function. And the variable within the identifier variable mappings refers to the actual object or value itself. You'll understand what this means shortly. Each lexical environment has three components. It has the environment record, it references the outer environment, and it has a this binding. And it binds this. Well, let's look at each one of those very quickly. The environment record is just the place where the variable and function declarations are stored inside the lexical environment. There's not much else to it. It's quite simple and straightforward. Now, when we look at the reference to the outer environment, that just means that it has access to its outer lexical environment. And that means that the JavaScript engine can look for variables inside the outer environment if they are not found in the current lexical environment. And we've also got the this binding. In this component, the value of this is determined or set. In the global execution context, the value of this refers to the global object. We've seen this. In browsers, that global object is the window object. And what about in a function execution context? What happens with the value of this? What is that? Well, that depends on how the function's called. If it's called by an object reference, then the value of this is set to that object. Otherwise, the value of this is going to be the global object, or even undefined if we're using strict mode. And finally, we have the variable environment. It's actually just a copy of the lexical environment. And in all practicality, there is no real difference between the two, except when working with statements. Because when you work with statements, it actually modifies the lexical environment and not the variable environment. But I don't want to be going into the with statements now, and many developers actually argue you should avoid the with statement altogether for performance reasons. So as such, just treat the two as pretty much the same thing. And although they are pretty much the same thing, in ES6, one difference between the lexical environment and variable environment component is that in the former, in the lexical environment, we store function declarations and the let and const variables. While in the variable environment, we only store the variable var. But again, going forward with coding, you and I should not be using var, we should be using let and const. But for the sake of you understanding it, I am going to throw in a few vars in the upcoming examples.